Lenin's State and Revolution, Chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6. The vulgarization of Marxism by the opportunists. The question of the relation of the state to the social revolution and of the social revolution to the state, like the question of revolution generally, was given very little attention by the most prominent theoreticians and publicists of the Second International, 1889 to 1914. But the most characteristic thing about the process of the gradual growth of opportunism which led to the collapse of the Second International in 1914 is that even when these people were squarely faced with this question, they tried to evade it or took no notice of it. In general, it may be said that evasiveness as regards the question of the relationship of the proletarian revolution to the state, an evasiveness which was to the advantage of opportunism and nurtured it, resulted in the distortion of Marxism and its complete vulgarization. To characterize this lamentable process, if only briefly, we shall take the most prominent theoreticians of Marxism, Plekhanov and Kautsky. Part 1. Plekhanov's controversy with the anarchists. Plekhanov wrote a special pamphlet on the relation of anarchism to socialism, Anarchism and Socialism, which was published in German in 1894. In treating this subject, Plekhanov contrived completely to evade the most urgent, burning and politically most essential issue in the struggle against anarchism, namely the relation of revolution to the state, and the question of the state in general. His pamphlet falls into two distinct parts. One of them is historical and literary, and contains valuable material on the history of the ideas of Stirner, Proudhon and others. The other is Philistine, and contains a clumsy dissertation on the theme that an anarchist cannot be distinguished from a bandit. A most amusing combination of subjects, a most characteristic of Plekhanov's whole activity on the eve of the revolution and during the revolutionary period in Russia. Indeed, in the years 1905 to 1917, Plekhanov revealed himself as a semi-doctrinaire and semi-Philistine, who in politics tailed after the bourgeoisie. We have seen how, in their controversy with the anarchists, Marx and Engels, with the utmost thoroughness, explained their views on the relation of revolution to the state. In 1891, in his foreword to Marx's critique of the Gotha programme, Engels wrote that we, that is Engels and Marx, were at that time, hardly 2 years after the Hague Congress of the First International, engaged in the most violent struggle against Bakunin and his anarchists. The anarchists had tried to claim the Paris Commune as their own, so to say, as a corroboration of their doctrine, and they utterly failed to understand its lessons and Marx's analysis of those lessons. Anarchism has failed to give anything even approximating the true answers to the concrete political questions. Must the old state machine be smashed, and what should be put in its place? But to speak of anarchism and socialism, while completely evading the question of the state, and failing to take note of the whole development of Marxism before and after the Commune, meant inevitably slipping into opportunism. For what opportunism needs most of all is that the two questions just mentioned should not be raised at all. That in itself is a victory for opportunism. Part 2. Kautsky's controversy with the opportunists. Undoubtedly, an immeasurably larger number of Kautsky's works have been translated into Russian than into any other language. It's not without reason that some German social democrats say in jest that Kautsky is more read in Russia than in Germany. Let us say, parenthetically, that there is a far deeper historical significance in this jest than those who first made it suspect. The Russian workers, by advancing in 1905 an extraordinarily great and unprecedented demand for the best works of the best social democratic literature in the world, and by receiving translations and editions of these works in quantities unheard of in other countries, transplanted, so to speak, at an accelerated pace, the enormous experience of a neighbouring, more advanced country to the young soil of our proletarian movement. Besides his popularisation of Marxism, Kautsky is particularly known in our country for his controversy with the opportunists, and with Bernstein at their head. But one fact is almost unknown, one which cannot be overlooked if we set ourselves the task of investigating how Kautsky drifted into the morass of unbelievably disgraceful confusion and defence of social chauvinism during the supreme crisis of 1914 to 15. This fact is the following. Shortly before he came out against the most prominent representatives of opportunism in France, Millerand and Joire, and in Germany, Bernstein, Kautsky betrayed great vacillation. The Marxist journal Zaria, which was published in Stuttgart in 1901-2 and advocated revolutionary proletarian views, was forced to enter into controversy with Kautsky, to characterize as rubber-like the half-hearted, evasive resolution conciliatory towards the opportunists that he proposed at the International Socialist Congress in Paris in 1900. Kautsky's letters, published in Germany, reveal no less hesitancy on his part before he took the field against Bernstein. Of immeasurably greater significance, however, is the fact that in his very controversy with the opportunists, in his formulation of the question and his manner of treating it, we can now observe, as we investigate the history of Kautsky's latest betrayal of Marxism, his systematic gravitation towards opportunism precisely on the question of the state. Let's take Kautsky's first important work against opportunism, his Bernstein and the Social Democratic Programme. Kautsky refutes Bernstein in detail, but here is a characteristic thing. Bernstein, in his Premises of Socialism, of Herostratian fame, accuses Marxism of blanquism, an accusation since repeated thousands of times by the opportunists and liberal bourgeois in Russia against the representatives of revolutionary Marxism, the Bolsheviks. In this connection, Bernstein dwells particularly on Marx's The Civil War in France, and tries quite unsuccessfully, as we have seen, to identify Marx's viewpoint on the lessons of the Commune with Proudhon's. Bernstein pays particular attention to the conclusion which Marx emphasized in his 1872 preface to the Communist Manifesto, namely that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. This dictum pleased Bernstein so much that he repeated it no less than 3 times in his book, interpreting it in the most distorted opportunist sense. As we have seen, Marx meant that the working class must smash, break up, shatter the whole state machine. But according to Bernstein, it would appear as though Marx, in these words, warned the working class against excessive revolutionary zeal when seizing power. A cruder and more hideous distortion of Marx's idea cannot be imagined. How then did Kautsky proceed in his most detailed refutation of Bernsteinism? He refrained from analysing the full depth of the distortion of Marxism by opportunism on this point. He cited the above-quoted passage from Engels' introduction to Marx's Civil War and said that according to Marx, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery, but that generally speaking, it can lay hold of it. And that was all. Not a word did Kautsky utter about the fact that Bernstein attributed to Marx the very opposite of Marx's real views, about the fact that since 1852, Marx had formulated the task of the proletarian revolution as being to smash the state machine. The result was that the most essential difference between Marxism and opportunism on the subject of the task of the proletarian revolution was slurred over by Kautsky. We can quite safely leave the solution of the problem of the proletarian dictatorship to the future, said Kautsky, writing Against Bernstein, page 172, German edition. This is not a polemic against Bernstein, but in essence a concession to him, a surrender of positions to opportunism. For at present, the opportunists ask nothing better than to quite safely leave to the future all fundamental questions of the task of the proletarian revolution. From 1852 to 1891, for 40 years, Marx and Engels taught the proletariat that it must smash the state machine. Yet in 1899, Kautsky, confronted with the complete betrayal of Marxism by the opportunists on this point, fraudulently substituted for the question of whether it is necessary to smash this machine the question of the concrete forms in which it is to be smashed, and then sought refuge behind the indisputable and barren Philistine truth that concrete forms cannot be known in advance. A gulf separates Marx and Kautsky as regards their attitudes towards the proletarian party's task of preparing the working class for revolution. Let us take the next more mature work by Kautsky, which was also to a considerable extent devoted to a refutation of opportunist errors. This is his pamphlet, The Social Revolution. In it, the author chose as his special theme the question of the proletarian revolution and the proletarian regime. He gave much that was exceedingly valuable, but it was precisely the question of the state that he evaded. Throughout the pamphlet, the author speaks of the conquest of state power, and no more. That is, he chooses a formula which makes a concession to the opportunists, inasmuch as it admits the possibility of conquering power without destroying the state machine. The very thing which Marx, in 1872, declared to be antiquated in the programme of the Communist Manifesto, is revived by Kautsky in 1902. A special section in the pamphlet is devoted to the forms and the weapons of the social revolution. Here, Kautsky speaks of the mass political strike, of civil war, and of the instruments of the might of the modern large state, i.e. the bureaucracy and the army. But not a word does he say about what the Commune had already taught the workers. Evidently, it was not without reason that Engels issued a warning, particularly to the German socialists, against superstitious reverence for the state. Kautsky sets forth the matter as follows. The victorious proletariat will carry out the democratic programme, and then he sets forth the clauses of the programme. But not a word does he utter about the new material provided by the year 1871 on the subject of the supersession of bourgeois democracy by proletarian democracy. Kautsky disposes of the question by uttering such solid banalities as, quote, still, it goes without saying that we shall not achieve supremacy under the present conditions. Revolution itself presupposes long and deep-going struggles, which, as they proceed, will change our present political and social structure. Undoubtedly, this goes without saying, just as does the truth that horses eat oats or that the Volga flows into the Caspian Sea. Only it is a pity that an empty and bombastic phrase about deep-going struggles is used as a means of evading a question of vital interest to the revolutionary proletariat. Namely, what makes its revolution deep-going in relation to the state, to democracy, as distinct from previous non-proletarian revolutions? By evading this question, Kautsky in practice makes a concession to opportunism on this most essential point. Although in words he declares stern war against it and emphasises the importance of the idea of revolution, how much is this idea worth if one is afraid to teach the workers the concrete lessons of revolution? Or says revolutionary idealism before everything else. Or announces that the English workers are now hardly more than petty bourgeois. Quote, the most varied forms of enterprises, bureaucratic, trade unionist, cooperative, private, can exist side by side in socialist society, Kautsky writes. There are, for example, enterprises which cannot do without a bureaucratic organisation, such as the railways. Here, the democratic organisation may take the following shape. The workers elect delegates, who form a sort of parliament, which establishes the working regulations and supervises the management of the bureaucratic apparatus. The management of other enterprises may be transferred to the trade unions, and still others may become cooperative enterprises. That's from pages 148 and 115, Russian translation, published in Geneva, 1903. This argument is erroneous. It is a step backward compared with the explanations Marx and Engels gave in the 70s, using the lessons of the Commune as an example. As far as the supposedly necessary bureaucratic organisation is concerned, there is no difference whatever between a railway and any other enterprise in large-scale machine industry, any factory, large store, or large-scale capitalist agricultural enterprise. The technique of all such enterprises makes absolutely imperative the strictest discipline, the utmost precision on the part of everyone in carrying out its allotted task, for otherwise the whole enterprise may come to a stop, or machinery or the finished product may be damaged. In all such enterprises, the workers will, of course, elect delegates who will form a sort of parliament. But the whole point is that this sort of parliament will not be a parliament in the sense of a bourgeois parliamentary institution. The whole point is that this sort of parliament will not merely establish the working regulations and supervise the management of the bureaucratic apparatus, as Kautsky, whose ideas do not go beyond the bounds of bourgeois parliamentarism, imagines. In socialist society, the sort of parliament consisting of workers' deputies will, of course, establish the working regulations and supervise the management of the apparatus. But this apparatus will not be bureaucratic. The workers, having conquered political power, will smash the old bureaucratic apparatus, shatter it to its very foundations until not a stone is left standing upon another, and they will replace it by a new one, consisting of the very same workers and office employees, against whose transformation into bureaucrats the measures will at once be taken which were specified in detail by Marx and Engels. 1. Not only election, but also recall at any time. 2. Pay not exceeding that of a workman. 3. Immediate introduction of control and supervision by all, so that all shall become bureaucrats for a time, and therefore nobody may be able to become a bureaucrat. Kautsky has not reflected at all on Marx's words. The Commune was to be a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time. Kautsky has not understood all the difference between bourgeois parliamentarism, which combines democracy, not for the people, with bureaucracy against the people, and proletarian democracy, which will take immediate steps to cut off bureaucracy at its root, and which will be able to carry out these measures to the end, to the complete abolition of bureaucracy, to the introduction of complete democracy for the people. Kautsky here displays the same old superstitious reverence for the state and superstitious belief in bureaucracy. Let us now pass on to the last and best of Kautsky's works against the opportunists, his pamphlet The Road to Power, which I believe has not been published in Russian, for it appeared when the reaction was at its height here in 1909. This pamphlet marks a considerable step forward, inasmuch as it does not deal with the revolutionary programme in general, as in the pamphlet of 1899 against Bernstein, or with the tasks of the social revolution irrespective of the time of its occurrence, as in the 1902 pamphlet. The social revolution. It deals with the concrete conditions which compel us to recognise that the era of revolutions is setting in. The author definitely points to the sharpening of class contradictions in general and to imperialism, which plays a particularly important part in this connection. After the revolutionary period of 1789 to 1871 in Western Europe, he says a similar period began in the East in 1905. A world war is approaching with menacing rapidity. The proletariat can no longer talk of premature revolution. We have entered a revolutionary period. The revolutionary era is beginning. These declarations are perfectly clear. This pamphlet of Kautsky's should serve as a measure of comparison between what German social democracy promised to be before the imperialist war and the depth to which it, Kautsky himself included, sank when the war broke out. The present situation, Kautsky wrote in the pamphlet we are examining, is fraught with the danger that we, i.e. German social democracy, may easily appear to be more moderate than we really are. It turned out that in reality, the German Social Democratic Party was much more moderate and opportunist than it appeared to be. It is all the more characteristic, therefore, that although Kautsky so definitely declared that the era of revolutions had already begun, he again completely evaded the question of the state in the pamphlet which he himself was devoted precisely to an analysis of the political revolution. These evasions of the question, these omissions and equivocations inevitably added up to that complete swing over to opportunism with which we shall now have to deal with in totality. German social democracy in the person of Kautsky seems to have declared, I abide by revolutionary views, 1899. I recognise in particular the inevitability of the social revolution of the proletariat, 1902. I recognise the advent of a new era of revolutions, 1909. Still, I am going back as compared with what Marx said as early as 1852, now that the question of the task of the proletarian revolution in relation to the state is being raised, 1912. It was precisely in this direct form that the question was put in Kautsky's controversy with Pannekoek. Part 3. Kautsky's controversy with Pannekoek. In opposing Kautsky, Pannekoek came out as one of the representatives of the left radical trend, which counted in its ranks Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Radek, and others. Advocating revolutionary tactics, they were united in the conviction that Kautsky was going over to the position of the centre, which wavered in an unprincipled manner between Marxism and opportunism. The correctness of this view was fully confirmed by the war, when this centrist, wrongly called Marxist trend, or Kautskyism, revealed itself in all its repulsive wretchedness. In an article touching on the question of the state, entitled Mass Action and Revolution in Newsweek 1912, volume 30, number 2, Pannekoek described Kautsky's attitude as one of passive radicalism, as a theory of inactive expectancy. Kautsky refuses to see the process of revolution. In presenting the matter in this way, Pannekoek approached the subject which interests us, namely the task of the proletarian revolution in relation to the state. Quote, "The struggle of the proletariat," he wrote, "is not merely a struggle against the bourgeoisie for state power, but a struggle against state power. The content of this, the proletarian revolution, is the destruction and dissolution of the instruments of power of the state by the instruments of power of the proletariat. The struggle will cease only when, as a result of it, the state organisation is entirely destroyed. The organisation of the majority will then have demonstrated its superiority by destroying the organisation of the ruling minority. on page 548. The formulation in which Pannekoek presents his ideas suffers from serious defects, but its meaning is clear nonetheless, and it is interesting to note how Kautsky went about refuting it. Quote, "Up to now," he wrote, "the antithesis between the Social Democrats and the anarchists has been that the former wished to conquer state power while the latter wished to destroy it. Pannekoek wants to do both." Page 724. Although Pannekoek's exposition lacks precision and concreteness, not to speak of other shortcomings of his article, which have no bearing on the present subject, Kautsky sees precisely on the essential point of principle involved, raised by Pannekoek. And on this fundamental question of principle, Kautsky completely abandoned the Marxist position when went over wholly to opportunism. His definition of the distinction between the Social Democrats and the anarchists is absolutely wrong, and he utterly distorts and vulgarizes Marxism. The distinction between the Marxists and the anarchists is this. 1. The former, aiming at the complete destruction of the state, recognize that this aim can only be achieved after classes have been abolished by the socialist revolution, as a result of the establishment of socialism, which leads to the withering away of the state. The latter want to destroy the state completely overnight, failing to understand the conditions under which the state can be destroyed. And 2, the former recognize that after the proletariat has conquered political power, it must utterly demolish the old state machine and substitute for it a new one, consisting of an organization of the armed workers, after the type of the commune. The latter, whilst insisting on the demolition of the state machine, have absolutely no clear idea of what the proletariat will put in its place and how it will use its revolutionary power. The anarchists even reject the utilization of state power by the revolutionary proletariat. They reject its revolutionary dictatorship. 3. The former demand that use be made of the present-day state in preparing for the proletariat for revolution. The anarchists reject this. In this controversy, it's not Kautsky but Pannekoek who represents Marxism, for it was precisely Marx who taught that the proletariat cannot simply conquer state power in the sense that the old state apparatus passes into new hands, but must break up this apparatus and replace it by a new one. Kautsky abandons Marxism and goes over to the opportunists. For this demolition of the state machine, which is utterly unacceptable to the opportunists, completely disappears from his argument, and he leaves a loophole for them in that conquest may be interpreted as a simple acquisition of a majority. To cover up his distortion of Marxism, Kautsky acts like a textualist. He puts forward a quotation from Marx himself. In 1850, Marx wrote that a determined centralization of power in the hands of the state authority was necessary. And Kautsky triumphantly asks, does Pannekoek want to destroy centralism? This is simply a trick, similar to Bernstein's identification of the views of Marxism and Prudhonism on the subject of federalism as against centralism. Kautsky's quotation is neither here nor there. Centralism is possible with both the old and the new state machine. If the workers voluntarily unite their armed forces, this will be centralism, but it will be based on the complete destruction of the centralized state apparatus, the standing army, the police and the bureaucracy. Kautsky acts like an outright swindler by evading the perfectly well-known arguments of Marx and Engels on the commune and plucking out a quotation which has nothing to do with the point at issue. Perhaps he, Pannekoek, Kautsky continues, wants to abolish the state functions of the officials. But we do not get along without officials even in the party and the trade unions, much less in the state administration. And our programme does not demand the abolition of state officials, but they be elected by the people. We are discussing here not the form of the administrative apparatus of the future state, but whether our political struggle dissolves the state power before we have captured it. Which ministry with its officials could be abolished? Then follows an enumeration of the ministries of education, justice, finance and more. No, not one of the present ministries will be removed by our political struggle against the government. I repeat, in order to avoid misunderstanding, we are not discussing here the form the future state will be given by a victorious social democracy, but how the present state is changed by our opposition. Page 725. This is an obvious sleight of hand. Pannekoek raised the question of revolution. Both the title of his article and the passages quoted above make this clear. In skipping to the question of opposition, Kautsky substitutes the opportunist for the revolutionary point of view. What he says means, at present we are in opposition. What we shall be after we have captured power, that we shall see. Revolution has vanished, and that is exactly what the opportunists wanted. What is at issue is neither opposition nor political struggle in general, but revolution. Revolution consists in the proletariat destroying the administrative apparatus and the whole state machine, replacing it with a new one consisting of the armed workers. Kautsky displays a superstitious reverence for ministries. But why can they not be replaced, say, by committees of specialists working under sovereign, all-powerful Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies? The essential point is not at all whether the ministries will remain, or whether committees of specialists or some other institutions will be set up. That is quite unimportant. The essential point is whether the old state machine, bound by thousands of threads to the bourgeoisie and permeated through and through with routine and inertia, shall remain or be destroyed and replaced by a new one. Revolution consists not in the new class commanding, governing with the aid of the old state machine, but in this class smashing this machine and commanding, governing with the aid of a new machine. Kautsky slurs over this basic idea of Marxism, or he has utterly failed to understand it. His question about officials clearly shows that he has not understood the lessons of the Commune or the teachings of Marx. We do not get along without officials even in the party and the trade unions. We do not get along without officials under capitalism, under the rule of the bourgeoisie. The proletariat is oppressed. The working masses are enslaved by capitalism. Under capitalism, democracy is restricted, cramped, curtailed, mutilated by all the conditions of wage slavery and the poverty and misery of the masses. This and this alone is the reason why the functionaries of our political organisations and trade unions are corrupted, or more precisely, tend to be corrupted by the conditions of capitalism and betray a tendency to become bureaucrats, i.e. privileged persons divorced from the masses and standing above the masses. That is the essence of bureaucracy, and until the capitalists have been expropriated and the bourgeoisie overthrown, even proletarian functionaries will inevitably be bureaucratised to a certain extent. According to Kautsky, since elected functionaries will remain under socialism, officials will remain, bureaucracy will remain. This is exactly where he's wrong. It was precisely the example of the Commune that Marx used to show that under socialism, functionaries will cease to be bureaucrats, to be officials. They will cease to be so in proportion as, in addition to the principle of election of officials, the principle of recall at any time is also introduced. And as salaries are reduced to the level of the wages of the average worker, and as parliamentary institutions are replaced by working bodies, executive and legislative at the same time. In essence, the whole of Kautsky's argument against Panikow, and particularly the former's wonderful point that we do not get along without officials even in our party and trade union organisations, is merely a repetition of Bernstein's old arguments against Marxism in general. In his renegade book, The Premises of Socialism, Bernstein wars against the ideas of primitive democracy and against what he calls doctrinaire democracy, binding mandates, unpaid officials, impotent central representative bodies, etc. To prove that this primitive democracy is unsound, Bernstein refers to the experience of the British trade unions, as interpreted by the Webbs. 70 years of development in complete freedom, he avers, convinced the trade unions that primitive democracy was useless, and they replaced it with ordinary democracy, i.e. parliamentarism, combined with bureaucracy. As a matter of fact, the trade unions did not develop in complete freedom, but in complete capitalist slavery, under which it goes without saying, we do not get along without a number of concessions to the prevailing evil, to violence, falsehood, and exclusion of the poor from the affairs of the higher administration. Under socialism, much of the primitive democracy will inevitably be revived, since for the first time in the history of civilized societies, the mass of the population will rise to take an independent part, not only in voting and elections, but also in the everyday administration. Under socialism, all will govern in turn and will soon be accustomed to no one governing. Marx, with his critico-analytical genius, perceived in the practical measures of the Commune the turning point, which the opportunists fear and do not want to recognise because of their cowardice, because they do not want to break irrevocably with the bourgeoisie, and which the anarchists do not want to perceive, either because they are in a hurry or because they do not understand at all the conditions of mass social change. We must not even think of destroying the old state machine. How can we get along without ministries and officials, argues the opportunist, who is completely saturated with Philistinism, and who at bottom not only does not believe in revolution, in the creative power of revolution, but mortally fears it, like our Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. We must think only of destroying the old state machine. It's no use probing into the concrete lessons of earlier proletarian revolutions and analysing what to put in the place of what has been destroyed and how, argues the anarchist. The best of the anarchists, of course, are not those who, following Messrs. Kropotkin and co., trail behind the bourgeoisie. Consequently, the tactics of the anarchists become the tactics of desperation. Instead of ruthlessly bold revolutionary work to solve concrete problems while taking into account the practical conditions of the mass movement. Marx teaches us to avoid both errors. He teaches us to act with supreme boldness in destroying the entire old state machine. At the same time, he teaches us to put the question concretely. The Commune was able in the space of a few weeks to start building a new proletarian state machine by introducing such and such measures to secure wider democracy and to uproot bureaucracy. Let us learn revolutionary boldness from the communards. Let us see in their practical measures the outline of urgently practical and immediately possible measures. And then pursuing this road, we shall achieve the complete destruction of bureaucracy. The possibility of this destruction is guaranteed by the fact that socialism will shorten the working day, will raise the masses to a new life, will create such conditions for the majority of the population as will enable everybody, without exception, to perform state functions. And this will lead to the complete withering away of every kind of state in general. Quote, its object, the object of the mass strike, Kautsky continues, cannot be to destroy the state power. Its only object can be to make the government compliant on some particular question, or to replace a government hostile to the proletariat by one that is accommodating towards it. But never, under no circumstances, can it, that is the proletarian victory over a hostile government, lead to the destruction of the state power. It can lead only to a certain shifting of the relation of forces within the state power. The aim of our political struggle remains, as in the past, the conquest of state power by winning a majority in Parliament, by converting Parliament into the master of the government. This is nothing but the purest and the most vulgar opportunism, repudiating revolution in deeds while accepting it in words. Kautsky's thoughts go no further than a government that is accommodating towards the proletariat, a step backward to Philistinism compared with 1847, when the Communist Manifesto proclaimed the idea of the proletariat organised as the ruling class. Kautsky will have to achieve his beloved unity with the Scheidemans, Plekhanovs and Vanderveldes, all of whom agreed to fight for a government that is accommodating towards the proletariat. We, however, shall break with these traitors to socialism, and we shall fight for the destruction of the whole old state machine in order that the armed proletariat itself shall become the government. These are two vastly different things. Kautsky would have to enjoy the pleasant company of the Legions and Davids, Plekhanovs, Potrasovs, Tseretellis and Chernovs, who were quite willing to work for the shifting of the relation of forces within the state power, for winning a majority in Parliament, and converting Parliament into the master of the government, a most worthy object, which is wholly acceptable to the opportunists, and which keeps everything within the bounds of the bourgeois parliamentary republic. We, however, shall break with the opportunists, and the entire class-conscious proletariat will be with us in the fight, not for a shifting of the relation of forces, but for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, for the destruction of bourgeois parliamentarism, for a democratic republic of the commune type, or a republic of Soviets, of workers and soldiers' deputies, for the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. To the right of Kautsky, in international socialism, there are trends such as the Socialist Monthly in Germany, Legion, David, Kolb, and many others, including the Scandinavians Storning and Branting, the followers of Juarez and Vandervelde in France and Belgium, Cirati, Treves, and other representatives of the right wing of the Italian party, the Fabians and Independents, the Independent Labour Party, which in fact has always been dependent on the Liberals in England, and the like. All these gentry, who play a tremendous, very often a predominant role in the parliamentary work and the party press, repudiate outright the dictatorship of the proletariat and pursue a policy of unconcealed opportunism. In the eyes of these gentry, the dictatorship of the proletariat contradicts democracy. There is really no essential difference between them and the petty bourgeois democrats. Taking this circumstance into consideration, we are justified in drawing the conclusion that the Second International, i.e. the overwhelming majority of its official representatives, has completely sunk into opportunism. The experience of the Commune has been not only forgotten, but distorted. Far from inculcating in the minds of the masses of workers the idea that the time is nearing when they must act to smash the old state machine, replace it by a new one, and in this way make their political rule the foundation for the socialist reconstruction of society, these people have actually preached to the masses the very opposite, and have depicted the conquest of power in a way that has left thousands of loopholes for opportunism. The distortion and hushing up of the question of the relation of the proletarian revolution to the state could not but play an immense role at a time when states which possess a military apparatus expanded as a consequence of imperialist rivalry have turned into military monsters, which are exterminating millions of people in order to settle the issue as to whether England or Germany, this or that finance capital, is to rule the world. The manuscript continues as follows. Chapter 7, The Experience of the Russian Revolutions of 1905 and 1917. The subject indicated in the title of this chapter is so vast that volumes could and should be written about it. In the present pamphlet, we shall have to confine ourselves naturally only to the most important lessons provided by experience, those touching directly upon the tasks of the proletariat in the revolution in relation to state power. Here the manuscript breaks off.